you. So what I'm going to talk about is really what has happened in the global economy over the last 18 months, and more importantly, what we see coming in the future. I think one of the messages that I'm going to communicate today is what the world will look like coming out of the downturn will be very different from where we were going into the downturn. So 2011 will not look like 2007. And there are a variety of changes that we should expect that I will talk about. So the first thing to say is we have seen huge change in the last 18 months. Companies like GM going bankrupt, entire industries such as the media industry being almost wiped out in many cases, newspapers now almost a historical anomaly. So many huge changes there. National economies like Iceland seeing enormous financial turmoil. And you can see in these headlines from The Economist how big the changes have been across the world. There have been three different ways in which the downturn has affected businesses. The first has been really to accelerate existing trends. So there were things that were already happening which the downturn has now speeded up. For example, the oil price spike that really took place at the start of the downturn has accelerated the importance of fuel efficiency, the push towards greener strategies, the reduction of carbon footprint, and the investment in new forms of energy. A second trend, we were already seeing the use of technology to reduce costs in a variety of ways. That's been accelerated by the downturn. We were talking about in the UK, we see supermarkets introducing self-service checkouts much more rapidly now because they are looking for ways to reduce costs, and that is a way of using technology to take their costs down. We see the increasing exercise of pricing power by buyers. So, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, there was already pressure to bring down the price of drugs, particularly from the US government. That has accelerated again as the government looks to ways to reduce costs and free up cash to invest in the recovery. And then, of course, we were already seeing a trend towards customers demanding new, better experiences, more differentiated experiences. The rapid change in customer values that we've seen in the downturn has really accelerated that as well. People are not tolerant of poor experiences anymore. Buyer values have changed dramatically. In many ways, the downturn was the product of a confidence crisis amongst consumers as consumer confidence went down, particularly after the failure of Lehman Brothers a year ago. People stopped spending. Initially, they stopped spending on discretionary products, things like consumer electronics, mobile handsets, going out to dinner, travel, entertainment. But quickly they stopped spending on big-ticket items as well, new cars, private education, new houses. And those changes spread ripples backwards through the economy. Businesses, at the same time, stopped spending on discretionary things like advertising, training, business travel, and then stopped spending on infrastructure. And again, we have seen the impact of those changes as, for example, cement companies all of a sudden see much lower output because people have stopped building new buildings and expanding their capacity. So we've seen a ripple effect as those buyer values have changed. An important phenomenon that we've seen, and this has a lot of implication for the future, is people's trust has been lost. People have really lost trust in traditional institutions, particularly banks, but not just banks, as a result of the downturn. And that lack of trust has also contributed to volatility because people are now much more quick to move their money because they don't feel confident about where they have their money. And so we've seen much higher volatility in the stock markets, but also in exchange rates. So this is, I think, a phenomenon of that lack of trust. And the third area, we've seen some really interesting new pressures be introduced. Regulation has come back and is really now a very strong force in most countries. I was with the head of the Confederation of British Industry the other day, who described regulation as contagious. It's like a disease. Once you get it in one place, it starts to spread to other places, and suddenly the government starts to look as though they are making industrial policy. So they're not just, protecting the banking customers. They're starting to make decisions about how banks should be run, and decisions about how automotive manufacturers should be run. In the UK, for example, when they introduced the cash for trade-ins to stimulate the auto industry, they said the dealerships have to pay half of this. So this is, again, starting to look like industrial policy. Another recent example, some of you may have read, the Latvian government is now suggesting that they will introduce a new law that caps the amount that mortgage borrowers have to pay at the value of the house. And since, of course, Latvian property values have gone down by 2/3 since the start of the downturn, this is a huge issue for the banks, mostly Swedish banks, who have loaned to them. So regulation is creating a huge new set of issues and challenges for many companies. The credit shortage has been also a very strong pressure. Many companies have gone bankrupt that would be otherwise actually quite strong, simply because they could not renew their lines of credit, or because covenants that they agreed to when they borrowed during the good times, which nobody thought about at that time, suddenly were breached, and those loans were not renewed. So we've seen a lot of good companies go out of business as a result of the shortage of credit. And it is also, in many industries, constrained the amount of investment. So I think as we look forward into the future, we may see continued spikes, because in some industries there's been underinvestment through the downturn as companies start to try to preserve cash. And finally, as I said, volatility in the markets, in the exchange rates, and in commodity prices have made it extremely difficult for companies to plan. So if you used to have an 18-month planning horizon, now you're lucky if you can have a plan that really is valid for 6 months. And so that's been a big change for companies as well. Industries have been affected to different degrees. So on the left-hand side, more incremental change for some of these industries: healthcare, aerospace and defense, pharmaceuticals, energy. These industries have tended to see an acceleration of trends, perhaps an introduction of more regulation, but on the whole are operating as they have traditionally operated. On the right, some of these industries have been radically transformed. Media, as I talked about, has been hugely affected by three things: the reduction in advertising spend, the fact that people are spending less. So when you used to buy the newspaper every day, maybe now you buy the newspaper 2 or 3 times a week. If you used to buy 3 magazines a week, maybe now you only buy 1. So that reduction in demand has affected them. And then, of course, the acceleration of moving from paper to electronic, or from CD to electronic distribution, has hugely affected the media companies. So that's an industry that is going to be fundamentally transformed. But these represent average outcomes for these industries. Within any industry, we've seen some companies who've done very well and other companies who've done very badly. And there are a lot of kind of things that companies can do to improve their outcomes. So, for example, in the airline industry, British Airways is having a hugely difficult time. Business class travel is greatly reduced. That's where they make a lot of their money from. And they are, struggling with reducing capacity, letting staff go, and canceling routes. At the other end, we have Ryanair. Many of you may know Ryanair, the big low-cost carrier. Ryanair, interestingly, are repeating an experience that we saw them go through in the last aviation downturn. So after September 9/11, when the big downturn in aviation in 2001, all of the airlines at that time were canceling routes, canceling aircraft orders, reducing capacity. And that's when Ryanair really began its big growth spurt. They opened up new routes. They negotiated exclusive deals with a number of airports. And interestingly, they put in an aircraft order with Boeing for 100 aircraft. Boeing, of course, at that time had just had huge cancellations from all of the airlines that they served. And so Ryanair was able to negotiate a fantastic price for 100 aircraft, and that's actually been a huge part of their success. They are operating from a much lower asset value than many of their competitors. Well, interestingly, in February 2009, Ryanair announced that they're going to put out to tender between Boeing and Airbus an order for 300 to 400 more aircraft. So a very interesting counter-cyclical behavior. And this is what you will see in the downturn is, and coming out of the downturn, big gaps opening up between the winners and losers, where the winners have used the downturn to their advantage, have behaved in counter-cyclical ways, have acquired assets at low price, have made acquisitions when everyone is trying to get out of markets, have expanded market share. And I think that's really part of the story is how can you be one of the winners coming out of the downturn rather than one of the losers? As we look at what the world will be like in the new normal, what normal will be like after the downturn, there are 5 dimensions of change. And you heard that I worked for Monitor Company and worked with Michael Porter, so I've used it, presented it a bit like the 5 forces. The first, and I think possibly the most important, is around customer needs and buying behavior. So people will behave differently, and it's very important to understand that and to think about how to serve them differently. The second is really what else is happening in the external environment. New entrants, changes in supplier power, and changes in supply disruption and substitution. And then there are 3 things that companies need to think about around how they operate themselves. So first of all, how will they grow in the future in an environment where cash is very constrained, opportunities have changed, they have to look for different ways to get that growth. The second is really around business models. How do companies need to configure themselves, organize their own activities, and deliver new skills and capabilities to compete more effectively? And then the third is leadership and talent. And I think we've seen big differences in outcomes for different companies that are driven primarily by the quality of leadership and the way in which those companies have been managed and led through the downturn. So the first change area to talk about is customer needs and buying behavior. We have, of course, as I said, seen huge changes in spending patterns in the downturn. And one of the questions we have to ask is that going to change, or will people go back to spending the way they spent before? My opinion is they will not. My opinion is that people will remain in love with thrift. It has become very fashionable in many countries to do without, to trade down. And if you used to buy, expensive designer clothing, now you go and shop in a high street store. If you used to shop at Marks and Spencer's, now you shop at Tesco's. So a lot of trading down, a lot of experimentation with lower priced things. And of course, we will see that endure for some time because consumers will actually feel poorer. Taxes are being raised in many countries. People have to rebuild their savings. The value of their investments has gone down, and their confidence in their investment value has gone down. House prices, which was really a driver of a huge amount of consumer confidence and consumer spending and borrowing in the past, are now much less certain. People do not feel confident that their house is going to be the thing that they will survive on when they retire. So I think that thrift is going to remain a reality in most major markets. And it's interesting, I speak in many different countries, and so I have an opportunity to talk to people from different backgrounds. And in all of them, I hear from people that they are so relieved not to have to spend all the time, not to have to buy the new car and keep up with the neighbors and invest in the new electronics and have the new clothes and the new handbag. And so I think there is also a phenomenon that people really are rejecting that consumerism that really drove behaviors up to 2007. And I think that will remain a fashion issue for some time. Secondly, customers are becoming more picky. When you spend less, you think more about what you're going to buy. And so other issues become important, like corporate social responsibility. Is this a company with values that I approve of, or is this company using child labor in order to make the products. People care more about their green credentials, the carbon footprint, and these are all becoming issues that companies have to look at more carefully. And people are also looking for distinctive experiences. So one of the things that we're seeing is actually the middle of the market is suffering the most. People with very differentiated products and offerings they've lost volume, but they've continued to retain loyalty with their customers. And people who have a very low cost, pared down offering have done well. People in the middle, whether it's retailers, consumer goods, the people who are in the middle have suffered the most. If you're not distinctive, if there's not a good reason for people to buy your products, then you are in trouble. We also see changes amongst business buyers. And I know this as Accenture, people are much more price sensitive now, much more use of procurement, many more e-auctions. So a lot of professional purchasing practices have been introduced because all companies are looking for ways to preserve cash and to spend less. We also see new ownership models. So this drive to preserve cash has really resulted in changes in the kind of ownership and business model that people want. So for example, we see software as a service, people wanting to instead of investing in your own ERP system, you actually can have it sourced from the cloud. We also see governments looking to have availability contracting rather than buying jets and tanks. They say, you supply me with the tanks and the spares, and I will pay you on the basis of how much we use them. So again, new ownership models. And I think that will continue because companies really will have an ongoing concern about their cash and how much they spend. And then finally, the emerging market has really continued to become, to grow in importance for many companies. Companies who had already a strong foothold in the emerging market have done disproportionately better through the downturn. And of course, even though growth has slowed as well in places like China and India, it has remained considerably higher than in Europe and North America. And so those companies have actually continued to improve. And we see some really big changes. So for example, in 2008, Volkswagen sold more cars in China than they sold in Germany, which was a huge change for them. Equally, other sort of high-end brands are starting to see very strong demand from China. Companies like Reckitt Benckiser, the consumer goods company, have seen very strong growth in those markets. But it's not just like competing in the West. It creates new challenges for those companies because these are consumers who have much less to spend, are much less sophisticated, are looking to try new experiences, buy in very small quantities. The infrastructure is different, so getting your product to market is very different. If you make washing powder, most of the people buying your washing powder don't have hot water, so there's no point adding a lot of technical capability that requires hot water to do it. So there's a big growth opportunity, but in order to go after that growth opportunity, companies are needing to change the way that they do business, change their products, and change their routes to market. And if you look at some of the data from the United States, this is U.S. consumer credit outstanding. If there is a further month of reduction, that will be the longest period of credit reduction since records began in the United States. So this is quite an unprecedented reduction in credit. And of course, the interpretations are different. Some people say this is a good thing because consumers are paying down their debt and soon they will feel able to start spending again. Others say this reflects the very poor state of the economy, the fact that people cannot afford to spend, the high joblessness rate in the United States, which is now just about 10%, and that's 10% of people actively looking for jobs. So this is really a very dramatic example of how consumer spending has gone down, and you see some quotes here. Not only have people lost money, but they don't expect as much appreciation in the money they have, and that will affect consumption. Never seen a softer U.S. consumer than we've seen today. And this is, of course, again affecting many different businesses, not just in the United States, but in all developed markets. The second area of change is really understanding what's happening in the competitive landscape. We've seen some big changes in the structure of industries. So first of all, there are many new entrants for some industries. Through the downturn, for example, Asian companies have continued to make acquisitions. Anybody with cash has actually been in a great position to buy assets at a low price. The acquisition of Lehman Brothers assets by Nomura was a huge change. The Japanese banks have not traditionally had a strong foothold in the West. This has transformed their position, and they are very excited about now really becoming a force on Wall Street and in the City of London. We've also seen some of the Chinese banks making acquisitions, also Chinese insurance companies, and so we've seen a lot of the emerging market multinationals using the downturn as an opportunity to build their footprint in developed markets, which allows them to acquire new skills, access bigger markets, and learn things that they can take to their home markets as well. We've also seen new entrants buying up assets at very low cost. So, for example, investors in distressed debt, like Oaktree Capital of the United States, can buy up the debt of a company at 20 to 30 cents on the dollar or on the pound, and basically enter the market at a much lower cost base than the competition. So again, many industries are facing competitors, new competitors, with a completely different cost base than they have, which will be challenging. And then, of course, expansion from adjacent markets. We talked about the lack of trust. One of the things that's happened in the United Kingdom is Tesco, the supermarket retailer, has now expanded into banking. And Sainsbury's is also talking about starting offering banking services. And if you had done this, I think 3 or 4 years ago, people would have said, no one will buy financial services from a supermarket. But now the banks have so little credibility as a result of the downturn. Banks like Royal Bank of Scotland, like Lloyd's Banking Group, have had such difficult times and have been so badly portrayed in the press that people say, I'm taking my business to a brand that I can trust. I'm going to go and bank with Tesco. I actually feel more confident about that. On the supply side, we've also seen some major disruptions to supply. The commodity spikes and commodity prices continue to be very volatile, which is threatening the profits for many industries. We've also seen the failure of critical suppliers, and in some industries that's actually been a factor that's driven other companies under, is that they can no longer get critical parts at the right price or of the right quality to run their own businesses. And we've seen withdrawal of essential services. So one big issue that has affected many companies is the inability to get trade credit, because the banks have been saying we don't want to offer trade credit anymore, or we offer it at a very high price, and therefore those companies can no longer trade the way they had, or they have to take giant risks in trading, and that has affected them as well. Substitution is a big issue. So we see many different forms of substitution. One great example, which actually we use a lot now, is because there was a huge pressure to stop business travel in order to reduce discretionary costs, many companies have started to use telepresence and other teleconferencing services as an alternative to business travel. So this is a huge issue for companies like British Airways, like Iberia. Instead of getting on a plane, you go to a room and talk to somebody on a screen. Actually, it's a very high-quality experience now with the high bandwidth, and it's a lot easier than taking a trip. So we start to see that kind of threat of substitution. Similarly, people stop going out to dinner and start staying home and making their own meals, or they stop going to movies and they stay home and watch pay TV instead. So many industries facing a big threat of substitution as people's behaviors change. But it's also an opportunity. Companies should be asking themselves, who might downshift to me, and how can I attract the customers of my competitors with offers that appeal to this desire for lower price. And then finally, as we talked about, new rules that are affecting the way the competition takes place. If we look at some of the effects, if we talk about the automotive industry, 5 years ago, this was the Hummer was really the aspirational vehicle for many people. This was the pinnacle of cool, is to buy this giant car that weighs, 4,700 pounds. I think that's probably 2,000 kilos, and costs a fortune and is enormous, and you can't park it anywhere. And you could run you could run over entire other cars and crush them if you wanted to. And now, of course, the new cool is now the Tata Nano. And interestingly, when you think about the future of the U.S. auto industry, the price of the Nano, this $2,500, that is approximately the average price of health insurance per vehicle that a U.S. auto manufacturer spends. So before they even buy any steel or assemble anything or pay any salaries, they've already spent that much money per vehicle just on health insurance for their employees. So you can understand why people are not very optimistic about the future of auto manufacturing in the United States. And of course, what's interesting is that Tata is, from the emerging world, very classic example of the sort of products being brought out there. The Hummer has just been sold by General Motors, and it has been sold to a Chinese company. So it's all moving to the east. So moving on then, companies really have to think about how are we going to get growth in the future? And the whole prospect for growth has changed dramatically. It used to be you could make acquisitions, you could borrow, balance sheets looked very different. Now, if you talk to CFOs, they say the pressure on them now to reduce debt, to deleverage the company, to preserve cash is enormous. And what that means is there is no money for acquisitions. There is no money to invest in infrastructure. There is much less money to invest in innovation. And so what we will see is a lot of companies basically reducing their prospects for growth dramatically because of this lack of cash. And the companies who do have cash will therefore have a much greater differential advantage in order to be able to grow. Some of the things that we see companies doing, we see a lot of asset disposals. People are having to sell non-core assets in order to fund growth. And really, this has, I think, prompted many companies to take a very hard look at their portfolios and say, do we need to do all these things ourselves? Should we be in this business? Does it make sense for us to compete in these many different markets? And if not, then they have to put those companies off for sale, or in many cases they take certain activities and they outsource them to others in order to preserve that cash. We've also seen a huge wave of cost reduction through the last 12 months. And indeed, that's probably a good thing because, coming off of the previous 5 years of growth, many companies were quite fat. They had made a lot of acquisitions. They had not been focused on efficiency. They'd been really focused on growth, and therefore there was a lot of fat to be cut. And then, of course, in an era where you don't have a lot of cash, you may not be able to afford keeping all of your innovation in-house. And indeed, that's another trend that we've seen. Pharmaceutical companies, for example, being much more networked with universities, with small startups, and drawing on a much wider range of sources for new products and new ideas. And that sort of trend is going to be seen much more broadly, that innovation becomes more dispersed, it becomes a network, and you need to understand how to operate in that network and focus on the areas that you are uniquely capable of doing and not try to do everything yourself. The companies that have the ability to invest, of course, will emerge much stronger. We've seen some good examples. Banco Santander, obviously making acquisitions, becoming one of the biggest banks in the UK now, but also making acquisitions elsewhere. Walmart has been making acquisitions in Russia, in Latin America, has been looking at many of the failing retail chains in the United States. And because, of course, their format is so much more appealing in a time of economic difficulty, they've been growing and acquiring market share, and again, using that to fuel acquisitions. ExxonMobil in the energy industry was very distinctive in that they said that we are not going to reduce any investment in exploration through the downturn, whereas many of their competitors dramatically reduced their exploration investments. And again, so we expect to see them emerging very strongly out of the downturn. And of course, if you're making acquisitions, the big competitor, which was private equity, they're out of the picture right now. They cannot borrow money, they can't get the funds, and so they're really not bidding for nearly as many assets as they have been in the past. So if you are in the market, you are in a much less competitive bidding environment than before, and that is reflected in much better prices. If you are investing in innovation or able to invest in innovation, now is a great time because customer needs have changed, so there are big opportunities to address these new needs in different ways. And secondly, your competitors are not able to fund similar innovation. So if you bring something out, you have the stage to yourself. A great example of that was the iPod, which was actually introduced at Christmas 2001, right after 9/11, and at a time when people thought this is a terrible time to introduce such a frivolous, kind of luxury product. It was twice as expensive as the nearest sort of functional product, and people just thought this will never go. And of course, as we know, it was a huge success, in part because it was genuinely innovative and genuinely different, and in part because they had the stage to themselves. Nobody else was making big product introductions at that time. Everybody was, holding things back and waiting for the mood to change. And so I think it was very fortunate for them that they had that stage to themselves. Companies also need to think about how they operate. And I think it's fair to say most companies have a business model that was optimized for a world of 5 or 10 years ago. So it is really now time for companies to say, how should we operate in order to be successful 5 years from now and not 5 years ago? So there are many different things that new challenges companies need to address. As we've talked about, customers are becoming more discerning, and companies need to not just identify customer segments, but actually deliver very differentiated outcomes for different customers. And that's true if you're operating in the developed world and the emerging world. As we talked about, emerging market customers have very different needs, different price points, different features valued. But it's also true in a given market, you need to start to understand this segment of customers wants these kinds of services, this kind of price point, this segment wants a different one. And that has big implications for how companies organize themselves, for where decisions get made. So you need to move decisions much closer to the customer in order to make that happen. And yet that creates also challenges of not introducing too much complexity. So some interesting new ways that companies have to think about how they organize. We talked about developed and emerging markets. And one of the issues there is those markets need very different governance. If you're operating in the emerging market, you cannot allow allow decisions to be made in the same way as you could in a developed market where you've been present for 20 years. Things change much more quickly. There are different rules. There are different ways of doing business that you may not be aware of. There's corruption in many cases. Or it's like the Wild West in some cases. So you have to have quite a different approach to governance. We talked about new forms of collaboration, and companies need to figure out how to do that. It's not when you have always had, kind of a big R&D center, very inward-looking, surrounded by a big fence. It's actually very difficult to move to a model where you actually bring ideas in from other places. People have to change their behaviors. You have to change how decisions are made. You have to have new ways of prioritizing different opportunities. So it has a lot of implications for how to manage. And then, of course, delivering scarce skills. What we are increasingly seeing is that companies take some very important skills like marketing analytics, and through technology, they make those skills available around the world. So it is no longer the case that you need to have dedicated people in every market doing the same thing. You can actually have one extremely talented group sitting somewhere in the world, perhaps in India, and providing those services around the company. So some big opportunities that are created by technology. And then we'll need new capabilities. So risk management has gone way up in importance on the agenda of management. They now understand they need to be managing for much higher volatility in the future, for kind of a much different kind of balance sheet structure, and managing their investors in a different way as well. Skills in forming alliances and brokering deals is going to be important because, again, companies will not be able to afford to do everything themselves, and so they need to start to think about how to partner with other companies, how to reduce their costs by, for example, forming consortiums that get economies of scale in things like printing or in telecoms infrastructure. Those are two areas that we've seen. And then, of course, the ability to work with external networks. And then finally, leadership and talent becomes an important area for companies to think about. We have seen a big difference in outcomes for companies that's been driven by the quality of leadership. In the first quarter of last year, I visited many companies as they were trying to think about how to respond to the downturn, and I was hugely struck by the difference in how they were treating it, what they were doing. Some companies very excited, seeing this as an opportunity, already starting to introduce new kinds of services, discontinuing other products, looking for acquisitions, thinking about making disposals, so moving very quickly, adjusting to the circumstances rapidly. Others absolutely frozen, completely uncertain of what to do, and taking no decisions at all. And there was a period of up to 6 months when some companies made no meaningful response to the downturn because they simply did not have a model for themselves of how to respond. And if you operate in a very traditional industry that has a 12-month planning cycle and a 3-year sort of planning horizon, all of a sudden those plans are meaningless and you don't know what to do. And so the quality of leadership and the way in which decisions get made matter hugely, because if you cannot suddenly empower people to look at new information and take different decisions, the company comes to a halt. Nothing happens. People don't know what to do. They have no guidelines for how to make new decisions. And so this is where strong leadership has made a huge difference. Have they been able to make those difficult decisions? Have they been able to establish a clear vision in which people can then move the company forward? And have they been able to delegate decision-making to others? Talent is going to be a big issue as we come out of the downturn. At the moment, as we all look to reduce our headcount and find ways of minimizing that, maybe we don't think about the talent challenge, but I promise you that in 2 or 3 years' time, the war for talent will be stronger than ever before, and it will be more difficult because many people will have left not just their companies, but their countries and their industries. We've seen huge economic migration from some countries as people have simply left and moved to other areas, in some cases because of a more favorable tax regime. We've also seen, for example, thousands of bankers leaving the industry and moving into becoming teachers and civil servants, and perhaps trying to do something a bit more worthy with their time. So I think the war for talent is going to be a huge issue, and as we look at the generation we're going to be fighting for, they have very different values. So they don't want to have a job for 30 years. They want to have flexibility. They want to think about working here for a couple of years and then moving over there. They care a lot more about things like corporate social responsibility and sustainability. They want to have a better quality of life. They want to be able to see their friends. They want access to all the technologies. They want to be on Facebook all the time. So it will be a very different world, and we have to be thinking already about how are we going to attract those talents and what will we have to change in our own companies to make it appealing for them. We did some analysis of companies coming out of the downturn in 1990, and what was very interesting is that it became clear that if you established a strong position in the downturn, if you used the downturn to increase your competitive advantage, maybe through acquisitions, through strengthening your core skills, through responding to changing customer needs, through innovation, that for 10 years afterwards, you were advantaged relative to those companies who did not do that. So big opportunities here for people to be establishing their relative competitive position for the next 10 years. So the bottom line, companies that create competitive advantage during a downturn pull away from the pack in the long term. So really, just to conclude, and I think I'm about on time here, this recession is more than a cyclical event. This is not, we're not going to go back to business as usual. We will see huge structural change across a range of industries, and we will see changes in customer behavior, industry structure, and the way that companies are run that will fundamentally transform businesses. The economic activity and demand patterns will not simply return to the pre-recession level. So 2007 will not be 2011. It will be something very different. Companies need to respond to these changes, identify new opportunities for growth, rethink their business model and optimize it for the world of the future, and think about how they lead their businesses and how they're going to attract talent for the future. Speed is important and strong leadership is essential. So every company should be understanding that while they think about their response, all their competitors are thinking about how they can take their market share away. And then I'll finish with my favorite quote from Jack Welch. When the pace of external change exceeds the pace of internal change, the end is in sight. That's it. Thanks.